There are many challenges and new issues in the oil markets, so I'll just focus on a couple of them that are interesting challenges and need to have good and high quality research applied. And some of these are just continuing changes, and you can even call them trends that have been happening in the oil market, but they're very, very important. We've seen, of course, a great growth in the Eastern Hemisphere in the demand for oil. And at the same time now, we're starting to see this growth in the Western Hemisphere and North America in the supply of oil and oil-related products. And this is going to change in a number of ways, kind of pricing mechanisms and pricing references. And that's something that I think a greater focus on would be helpful in the market. I think there's many of the opinion that especially in the Asian markets, they really haven't benefited from something in terms of valuing their base crude oil price that is really directly relevant to their region. And now that we're seeing shifts in how the supply might come into that region, this is something that, what are the impacts of that? Has there been any pricing impacts? Have there been any flow of funds impacts? Have there been any greater impacts on their economies? And will this become greater, or and how will that change over the coming years? So I think that that's an area that economists, and it's just one of a number of them, as I said, but that's an area where economists could focus and we'd benefit from that research. What I focused on was looking at really the two established oil benchmarks. The one of, we call it WTI, but light sweet oil from North America, and on the Brent, which is also really short for 4 different crude oils in the North Sea. And I focused on those mechanisms, and I was trying to further the evaluation of how responsive they are to oil market fundamentals of supply and demand. And this is an area that there's some subtleties there, but the reason it's important is that policymakers have been looking at benchmarks. And policymakers are frequently motivated by politics. And politics is not necessarily very patient in terms of understanding things very well. Once the motivation to open up policy making occurs, frequently the policymakers do not have the time, for whatever reasons, to really understand thoroughly what they're looking at. And there has been some evaluation of benchmarks, and it's not at all clear that the policymakers have command of really all the important facts related to those. So my research has been trying to help understand that better, so that that's something at least they have accessible to them to make them better informed. The 2 different major benchmarks actually do seem to behave differently with respect to fundamentals in the marketplace. I think there's general agreement by oil market participants that WTI is very responsive to well-known fundamentals. Sometimes with Brent, some analysts have just presumed it's very responsive, but they've been unable to identify what those fundamentals are. And I've certainly raised the question that the Brent mechanism is largely driven as a negotiation of price mechanism, which is an important mechanism, but not specifically one that's responding to supply and demand influences. It probably impacts responses of supply and demand, and the 2 of mechanisms together are very, very important. To some, there may be subtleties there, But given that price references have entered into the sphere of policy making, or at least looking into them, it is important that those policymakers be better informed on them.